Picture a world where every step, every glance, every breath of a woman was measured against invisible rules. A world of corsets and carriages, of lace curtains hiding secrets no one dared to speak aloud. Behind the polished manners of Victorian society lay silent wars of identity, of love, of survival. These were women who lived in cages of etiquette, yet found ways to resist, to dream, to rebel. Tonight, we open the curtains on their world, not the one history books show, but the one whispered behind closed doors. The Victorian age, spanning the reign of Queen Victoria from 1837 to 1901, was a period of dazzling progress and suffocating restraint. To the outside world, Britain appeared as the unrivaled empire of industry, innovation, and refinement. Its literature, architecture, and etiquette defined an era. But beneath the polished veneer, Victorian society was obsessed with appearances in ways that shaped and constrained women's daily lives more than almost any other group. Theirs was a world of rules, both spoken and unspoken. Expectations dressed as virtues, and silence disguised as dignity. The concept of the angel in the house, drawn from Coventry Patmore's 1854 poem, became the moral emblem of womanhood. Women were expected to embody purity, submission, and devotion to family. Their purpose, according to prevailing norms, was not to participate in public life, but to provide moral guidance from the confines of home. This ideal was reinforced by a society that valued reputation above all. The worth of a woman was not measured in her education or ambitions, but in her ability to uphold her family's respectability. The Victorian obsession with appearances began in the home, the central stage upon which social performance unfolded. A well-furnished drawing room was more than a place for leisure. It was a declaration of moral standing. Lace curtains, heavy draperies, and carefully arranged furniture were outward signs of inward virtue. Guests were judged not only on conversation, but on how the home reflected their hostess's sense of propriety. Women bore the weight of this responsibility, for the arrangement of the household and the preservation of its image were considered their natural domain. Dress was another visible marker of respectability. The crinoline, popular in the mid-19th century, expanded skirts to enormous proportions, demanding careful movement and constant vigilance. Corsets tightened waists to impossibly small sizes, restricting breathing and limiting mobility. These garments symbolized discipline, control, and submission to social expectations. The very act of dressing was a daily rehearsal of restraint, a reminder that women's bodies were subject to scrutiny. By the 1870s, fashion had shifted to the bustle, exaggerating the curve of the hips. Every change in style reinforced the message that women's worth lay in appearance, not autonomy. The gilded cage was not only physical, but also intellectual. Formal education for girls was limited, especially in the early Victorian period. Middle and upper-class daughters were instructed in accomplishments, music, drawing, embroidery, and the art of conversation, rather than in subjects that might encourage independence. While universities slowly began to admit women, in the later decades of the century, the prevailing view was that too much education endangered femininity. Medical theories at the time warned that intellectual exertion could damage reproductive health, reinforcing the belief that women were unfit for serious study. This obsession with appearances extended to morality. A woman's reputation was fragile, and one misstep could ruin her prospects forever. The notion of fallen women haunted Victorian culture. Novels, sermons, and newspapers frequently warned of the dangers of impropriety. often blaming women more harshly than men for moral failings. Even minor breaches of decorum, being seen alone with a man speaking too freely or dressing inappropriately, could provoke scandal. Social survival depended on constant vigilance. Marriage was central to this system of appearances. A well-matched union was not only a personal milestone, but a family achievement. For middle and upper-class women, marriage was the primary route to security and social status. Yet, the legal framework reflected women's subordination. Until the Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882, wives had no legal right to their own earnings or property. Everything belonged to their husbands. Divorce was made slightly more accessible in 1857, but the terms were still uneven. A husband could divorce his wife for adultery alone, while a wife had to prove adultery, plus additional offenses such as cruelty or desertion. Appearances of marital harmony were thus preserved, even in the face of deep personal suffering. Religion added another layer to the gilded cage. The Victorian ideal of womanhood was often couched in Christian morality. Churches preached the virtues of obedience, modesty, and chastity, reinforcing social hierarchies with divine authority. Women were encouraged to see themselves as moral guardians, but always within the home, never in positions of public power. Evangelical movements sometimes gave women new avenues for service, such as teaching or charity work, but these roles remained framed as extensions of domestic duty. Even leisure was bound by rules. Social calls were carefully timed and meticulously recorded in calling cards, which were exchanged to maintain networks of respectability. Afternoon teas, garden parties, and evening balls were not simply entertainment but performances of social grace. Each encounter was a negotiation of rank, reputation, and propriety. The wrong guest list or an overly forward comment could have lasting consequences. This relentless focus on appearances had profound consequences on women's health and well-being. The corset restricted breathing and sometimes displaced internal organs, leading to fainting spells and chronic discomfort. Medical literature of the time described female hysteria, a catch-all diagnosis for symptoms ranging from anxiety to fatigue, often caused by the pressures of confinement and lack of autonomy. Instead of addressing the root causes, doctors prescribed rest cures, which further isolated women from intellectual or social stimulation. The gilded cage was thus reinforced not only by social customs, but also by medical authority. Yet, within this restrictive world, there were cracks in the facade. Women found subtle ways to resist or redefine their roles. The rise of women's magazines provided forums for discussing fashion, morality, and eventually reform. Writers like Florence Nightingale and Harriet Martineau used the language of respectability to argue for women's contributions beyond the home. Even Queen Victoria herself, while embodying domestic ideals as wife and mother, ruled as a sovereign, symbolizing both continuity and contradiction. Working-class women experienced the gilded cage differently. For them, appearances mattered less, in terms of drawing rooms and lace curtains, but the pressure of respectability was no less real. Domestic service employed vast numbers of women who lived under strict codes of conduct in their employers' households. Factory work and other forms of labor exposed women to harsh conditions and low wages. Yet even these environments were shaped by judgments of morality and virtue. Working-class respectability was tied to sobriety, cleanliness, and family stability, ideals that were difficult to maintain under economic hardship. The obsession with appearances also extended to empire. Victorian ideals of femininity were exported to colonies. where British women were seen as bearers of civilization. Their behavior abroad was scrutinized as a reflection of national character. The pressure to uphold appearances thus followed them across continents, binding personal conduct to imperial identity. By the closing decades of the 19th century, cracks in the gilded cage became more visible. The women's suffrage movement gained momentum, challenging the notion that women's voices should remain confined to the home. Reformers argued for expanded education, property rights, and legal protections. Yet even as these changes unfolded, the Victorian obsession with appearances remained deeply ingrained. The gilded cage had not disappeared. It had simply begun to show its bars more clearly. The paradox of the Victorian age lies in its simultaneous progress and restraint. While the period produced advancements in science, technology, and political reform, it also enshrined a rigid system of gender roles. For women, life was shaped less by opportunities than by the careful maintenance of respectability. Their world was one of elegance and beauty, but also of surveillance and silence. To step outside the cage was to risk everything. To remain inside was to sacrifice freedom. Behind the lace curtains, the gilded cage glittered with refinement, but it was still a cage, and within it, countless women lived lives defined by appearances, admired from afar, but confined at the core. Asterisk. Victorian Britain was a society held together not only by institutions and laws, but by an elaborate architecture of rules. These were not statutes written in Parliament or enforced by police, but unwritten codes that governed daily life with an authority just as powerful. For women, these rules reached into every gesture, every encounter, and every decision. They formed a system of invisible boundaries that shaped identity, behavior, and destiny. At the heart of these rules was the concept of propriety. To be proper was to be respectable, and to be respectable was to be secure. For women, reputation was more than personal standing. It was a form of social currency that determined the possibilities of marriage, friendships, and survival. A misplaced word, an unchaperoned walk, even a glance judged bold could damage a woman's image in ways difficult to repair. The architecture of rules thus demanded constant vigilance, a near-permanent awareness of how one appeared to others. Public spaces were among the most regulated. A woman of the middle or upper classes could not simply stroll unaccompanied, walking alone through the streets of London or Manchester was considered improper, unless the destination was beyond reproach, a church, a market, or a charitable visit. Otherwise, a lady required the presence of a companion or a maid. Men could walk freely, but women risked their reputation if they appeared without protection. This rule reinforced the idea that women were vulnerable and in need of supervision, while also limiting their independence in one of the most basic human activities, movement. Even within acceptable destinations, rules multiplied. Calling on acquaintances required adherence to strict rituals. A visitor left a calling card, embossed with her name, folded in specific ways to signal intention. A corner turned down to indicate a personal visit. A card left untouched for a formal introduction. The hour of arrival mattered. Too early suggested presumption. Too late bordered on disrespect. Conversations were measured, with topics carefully chosen to avoid impropriety. Politics, religion, and personal affairs were largely avoided unless, among close family meals, too, were choreographed. Dinner parties were stages upon which etiquette was performed with precision. The arrangement of seating reflected social hierarchy. Women and men alternated along the table, ensuring balance. Dishes were served in specific orders, and eating itself carried rules. To place an elbow on the table or to serve oneself before others was considered uncouth. For women, dinner conversations offered opportunities for display, not of wit, in excess, which could appear unfeminine, but of charm, modest knowledge, and gracious manners. To speak too little was to appear dull. To speak too much risked seeming bold. Courtship rituals were among the most regulated aspects of Victorian life. A young woman did not meet a suitor privately. Every interaction required the presence of a chaperone, often her mother, an aunt, or another trusted relative. Letters between unmarried men and women were discouraged, for written words left dangerous evidence. Gifts carried meaning and had to be exchanged with care. Flowers, for example, were freighted with symbolism. Roses signaled love, lilies, purity. Violets, modesty. A misinterpreted bouquet could spark gossip. Courtship unfolded slowly, with layers of ritual designed to prevent scandal. Marriage itself was the ultimate confirmation of respectability, yet the rules extended even here. A married woman's duty was to embody loyalty, discretion, and modesty. The slightest appearance of impropriety, a friendship judged too close, a public laugh considered too loud, could lead to whispers of infidelity. The 1857 Matrimonial Causes Act made divorce a public matter, with proceedings reported in newspapers. Scandals surrounding divorce cases fascinated the public, but destroyed the women involved. For them, the rules of respectability were not only social expectations, but safeguards against ruin. Religious observance provided further reinforcement. Sunday attendance at church was not merely spiritual, but social. Families displayed their piety and status through dress, punctuality, and attentiveness. Women in particular were judged on modest attire and devout demeanor. Religious societies, charity work, and missionary activities allowed women to participate in public life, but only under the framework of faith. To step outside these boundaries risked accusations of irreverence or pride. The architecture of rules was not confined to the upper classes. Working-class women also lived under codes of respectability, though shaped by economic reality. Respectable working women were expected to maintain cleanliness in their modest homes, to avoid drunkenness, and to raise children with discipline. For servants, the rules of their employers became their own. They navigated curfews, dress codes, and constant surveillance, their livelihoods dependent on obedience. Respectability among the working classes offered a fragile defense against accusations of immorality, which could result in dismissal from work or exclusion from community networks. Print culture amplified the power of these unwritten laws. Magazines such as the English Woman's Domestic Magazine and advice manuals by writers like Mrs. Beeton set standards for household management, dress, and conduct. Etiquette books proliferated, offering guidance on everything from letter writing to mourning rituals. One such manual, The Habits of Good Society, 1859, warned that manners are the shadows of virtues. By linking external behavior to inner morality, these guides reinforced the idea that appearances were not superficial, but essential to character. Even grief had rules. Mourning customs were among the most visible displays of propriety. Following the death of a husband, a widow was expected to wear black for up to 2 years, progressing slowly to muted greys and purples. The duration and intensity of mourning signaled the depth of respectability. Queen Victoria herself became the model of perpetual mourning after Prince Albert's death in 1861, setting a tone for the nation. Women who failed to follow mourning rituals risked accusations of coldness or impropriety. Thus, even in sorrow, appearances were dictated by rigid codes. Health and medicine intertwined with social rules in complex ways. The cult of female fragility encouraged women to adopt behaviors that emphasized delicacy. Fainting, nervousness, and sensitivity were considered signs of refinement. Doctors and moralists warned against excessive physical exertion or intellectual strain, arguing that these could damage reproductive capacity. The medical profession lent authority to the architecture of rules by presenting them as natural or biological truths. Women who transgressed by seeking education, careers, or physical freedom were warned that they risked not only social disgrace, but their health and femininity. The reach of these rules extended into empire and global identity. British women abroad were expected to embody the ideals of the nation. Their dress, manners, and conduct were scrutinized as representations of imperial authority. Travelers and colonial wives navigated both the expectations of British propriety and the challenges of foreign environments. Their behavior abroad was not seen as personal but as political, carrying implications for Britain's image as a civilizing power. By the late Victorian period, cracks began to appear in this architecture. The rise of the women's rights movement directly challenged many of the rules. Campaigners like Josephine Butler, who fought against the Contagious Diseases Acts of the 1860s, confronted the double standard that punished women suspected of prostitution while excusing men. Butler's work exposed how rules of propriety could be weaponized to control and exploit women. The suffragettes of the 1890s and early 1900s deliberately disrupted social rituals, refusing to conform to expected silence. By breaking the rules, they revealed their constructed nature, and yet the rules did not vanish quickly. They remained deeply embedded in everyday life, passed down through generations, sustained by habit, fear, and the promise of respectability. The architecture was strong because it was invisible, constructed not of stone but of expectations, reinforced daily in drawing rooms, churches, workplaces, and streets. For Victorian women, to live respectably was to live within the cage of these rules, and to question them was to risk everything. Among the many symbols of the Victorian age, none carried more cultural weight than the corset. It was more than a garment. It was an instrument of discipline, a visible reminder of the invisible rules that governed women's lives, worn by women. Across classes, from aristocrats to shopgirls, the corsets shaped not only the body but also society's vision of femininity. In the 19th century, to be laced into a corset was to be bound by expectations that were social, medical, and moral. The origins of the Victorian corset lay in earlier centuries. Stays, as they were known in the 18th century, compressed the torso into a rigid cone. By the 1820s, fashion began to emphasize a natural waistline, and the corset evolved into the curved hourglass silhouette associated with the 19th century. This was no passing fashion. The corset endured as the essential foundation of women's clothing for nearly the entire Victorian era, becoming an unavoidable part of daily life. The cultural significance of the corset extended beyond aesthetics. It represented control over the body, control over behavior, and control over sexuality. A tightly laced waist signified discipline and refinement, qualities associated with respectability. In a society obsessed with appearances, the corset offered visible proof that a woman conformed to the standards of her time. A loose or absent corset could suggest looseness of character, a dangerous signal in a culture that linked outward appearance to inner virtue. Medical debates about the corset revealed the tensions at the heart of Victorian society. Critics warned of its dangers. The physician William Buchan condemned tight lacing as early as the 18th century, and by the mid-19th century, medical journals published alarming diagrams of displaced organs and compressed lungs. Articles in the Lancet described how corsets restricted breathing, impaired digestion, and could even deform the ribcage. Yet, despite these warnings, corsetry persisted. Many doctors themselves recommended moderate lacing, arguing that proper use improved posture and supported weak spines. The medical profession was divided, but what remained clear was that the corset was seen as a marker of femininity too deeply embedded to discard. The practical experience of wearing a corset varied. For many middle and upper-class women, corsets were custom-made, carefully fitted to balance fashion with comfort. For working-class women, mass-produced corsets were often ill-fitting and harsher on the body. Yet even those employed in demanding labor, factory work, domestic service, or agricultural labor wore them. Respectability demanded it. Employers often expected maids to dress in corsets as part of maintaining a proper appearance, even if the garment restricted movement. During heavy work, fashion trends exaggerated the corset's demands. In the 1850s and 1860s, the crinoline expanded skirts to vast proportions, making the narrow waist appear even smaller by contrast. By the 1870s and 1880s, the bustle shifted emphasis to the hips and back, but the corset remained central. Advertisements of the time promoted waists measuring 16 inches or less, though such extremes were rare in practice. Still, the pursuit of the wasp waist became a cultural ideal, reinforced by fashion plates, photographs, and even department store mannequins. The act of lacing a corset carried its own symbolism. For upper-class women, dressing often required assistance, usually from a maid. The tightening of laces each morning was a ritual that underscored dependence and submission. Working-class women who laced themselves still experienced the daily constraint as a discipline. Whether performed by others or by oneself, the act reaffirmed that the female body was to be shaped, restrained, and displayed according to societal standards. Criticism of corsetry grew throughout the century. Feminist writers and reformers argued that the garment symbolized female oppression. Amelia Bloomer, an American advocate for dress reform, championed looser clothing and the so-called Bloomer costume, a tunic worn over baggy trousers. Although it gained attention in the 1850s, the style was ridiculed in both Britain and the United States, and its association with early feminism made it a target of mockery. The Rational Dress Society, founded in London in 1881, promoted healthful clothing that did not deform the body. Its members condemned tight lacing and campaigned for looser corsets or none at all. Yet the movement struggled against entrenched cultural ideals. The corset was also entangled with morality. In Victorian thought, the disciplined body reflected a disciplined mind. A well-laced waist signaled modesty, self-control, and virtue. In contrast, the absence of a corset was linked with impropriety or even promiscuity. The garment thus functioned as both a physical and symbolic restraint, aligning with the broader architecture of rules that demanded women embody restraint in every sphere. For some women, corsets offered a sense of empowerment within restrictive norms. Properly fitted, they provided back support, improved posture, and gave the wearer a fashionable silhouette. In a society where appearance could determine opportunity, the corset could be seen as a tool of social advancement. A woman well-dressed and tightly laced presented herself as respectable, signaling belonging in polite society. The paradox was clear. The very garment criticized for oppression also served as a passport to social legitimacy. Commerce expanded. The corset's reach. By the mid-19th century, industrial production brought ready-made corsets to markets and department stores. Manufacturers experimented with materials, from whalebone and steel to cording and elastic. Patents for new designs proliferated, promising comfort, health, or beauty. Advertisements in women's magazines promoted corsets not only as garments, but as necessities, assuring readers that without them, true elegance was impossible. The corset industry employed thousands of workers, many of them women, sewing the garments that would in turn constrain their own bodies. Even art and literature reinforced the corset's cultural weight. Fashion illustrations celebrated ever narrower waists, while novels and plays made references to women fainting or struggling for breath. Caricatures mocked tight lacing, yet by doing so they reinforced the idea that women's bodies were legitimate, subjects of scrutiny. Corsets became visual shorthand for femininity, instantly recognizable in portraits, advertisements, and costume. By the late 19th century, however, new forces began to challenge the corset's dominance. The rise of women's sports, cycling, tennis, and gymnastics demanded looser clothing. Reformers promoted the health corset, designed with less rigid structure and greater freedom of movement. Medical professionals increasingly linked restrictive corsetry with poor health outcomes, while the corset remained a staple of fashion into the Edwardian era. By the 1890s, its critics were louder and more organized, yet the cultural hold of the corset was not easily broken. Even as women marched for the vote and campaigned for legal rights, many continued to wear corsets daily. The garment endured because it was not simply imposed from above. It was woven into the very fabric of social life. To abandon it meant not only rejecting fashion, but challenging the values of propriety, discipline, and respectability that underpinned Victorian society. The corset thus exemplified the paradox of the Victorian woman's existence. It offered elegance while enforcing restriction, status while demanding sacrifice, identity while erasing autonomy. To be laced was to be bound not only by fabric and steel, but by the weight of expectations. The gilded cage of appearances extended inward, pressing against ribs and lungs, shaping not only the outer silhouette, but the very breath of those who wore it. In this way, corsets became the perfect symbol of Victorian control, beautiful, admired, and suffocating. The Victorian drawing room was more than a space for leisure. It was the central stage of domestic life, a place where appearances were rehearsed and reputations maintained. Behind its polished furniture and heavy draperies lay a world of unspoken rules and quiet tensions, where women carried the burden of upholding their family's social standing. To understand the drawing room is to glimpse the shadows of a society that prized order, restraint, and propriety above all in middle and upper class households. The drawing room functioned as the visible heart of the home. Visitors seldom saw kitchens or bedrooms. Those were private domains, hidden from respectable eyes. The drawing room, by contrast, was carefully curated to reflect the family's refinement. Carpets, wallpapers, and furniture were chosen with care, not simply for comfort, but for the impression they conveyed. Tasteful decoration signaled moral integrity. Clutter or poor style could provoke whispers of inadequacy. For women, this responsibility was immense. The condition of the drawing room reflected directly on the lady of the house. Etiquette manuals, and women's magazines provided endless instruction on how to arrange and manage these rooms. Mrs. Isabella Beeton, whose book of household management was first published in 1861, offered guidance not only on cooking and cleaning, but on the presentation of the home itself. A woman who failed to maintain her drawing room risked being judged as idle or careless, regardless of her personal qualities. In this way, domestic space became both a canvas and a cage, shaping women's identities through their surroundings. The act of receiving visitors was central to the role of the drawing room. Social calls were highly ritualized. Ladies of the household would sit prepared, dressed in appropriate attire, ready to greet callers at designated hours. The exchange of calling cards and the precise length of visits were markers of status. A short visit signified politeness. A longer stay implied intimacy. These nuances were carefully observed, and any deviation could affect reputations. Conversations within the drawing room were similarly bounded by rules. Topics considered safe included the weather, travel, or charitable activities. Religion and politics were generally avoided, unless among trusted friends. A woman was expected to display just enough intelligence to be engaging, but never so much as to appear argumentative. Wit could charm, but sharpness risked offense. These unwritten codes demanded constant self-monitoring, creating an atmosphere where shadows of thought and feeling often remained unspoken. The architecture of the room itself reflected these dynamics. Heavy curtains blocked the outside world, both literally and symbolically. Furniture was arranged to encourage polite conversation, with chairs facing each other at measured distances. Ornaments, family portraits, and carefully placed pianos or bookshelves created a curated sense of culture. Yet the same elements that signaled refinement also restricted spontaneity. The room was not a place for unguarded expression, but for performance, a stage upon which the play of respectability was endlessly enacted. For women, the drawing room was both a place of authority and a site of confinement. Within this space, the lady of the house presided, managing her household and social network. Yet, her authority rarely extended beyond these walls. In a society where public life was dominated by men, the drawing room represented the limits of her recognized sphere. It was her domain, but also her boundary. The very space that confirmed her importance simultaneously underscored her exclusion from broader arenas of influence. The drawing room also carried moral weight. It was here that young women were introduced to potential suitors under the watchful eyes of mothers and aunts. Courtship unfolded amid carefully staged encounters, where every glance and word was measured. Privacy was rare, and genuine intimacy difficult. In this sense, the drawing room was a space of surveillance as much as of hospitality. The shadows of the curtains mirrored the shadows of unspoken judgment that hovered over every interaction. Households had their own versions of this dynamic, though on a smaller scale. A front room or parlor served as the equivalent of the drawing room, often kept in pristine condition for guests, while the family lived more comfortably in back rooms or kitchens. The effort to maintain such a space reflected the universal importance of respectability. Even families with limited means invested in a room that could symbolize order and morality. In these modest parlors, the shadows were no less real, as families struggled to present an image of stability despite economic hardship. Mourning practices revealed another layer of the drawing room's significance. Following a death in the household, it became the site of rituals that displayed grief according to societal standards. Visitors arrived to offer condolences, and the room itself was transformed to reflect mourning. Black draperies or subdued decoration signaled respect, reinforcing the idea that personal sorrow must be expressed through controlled appearances. Queen Victoria's lifelong mourning for Prince Albert set a national example, and her private rooms at Osborne House and Windsor Castle became symbols of enduring grief. Across Britain, women followed suit, turning drawing rooms into spaces where even grief was. Regulated by propriety, literature of the period captured the drawing room's dual nature. Novels by Jane Austen's successors, such as Elizabeth Gaskell and Anthony Trollope, often depicted drawing room scenes as battlegrounds of manners, where social ambitions clashed beneath the surface of polite conversation. The drawing room became a literary shorthand for society itself, outwardly calm, inwardly turbulent, filled with shadows of hidden motives. The persistence of these rituals reveals how deeply appearances governed Victorian life. The drawing room was not merely decorative, it was structural, sustaining the architecture of rules that defined gender and class. By confining women to the role of guardians of respectability, it reinforced the notion that their primary contribution lay in appearances, rather than achievements. And yet, within these confines, women exercised subtle forms of influence. Through hospitality, matchmaking, and the quiet shaping of reputations, they wielded power that, while limited, was real. As the 19th century progressed, the drawing room itself began to change. Industrialization and the rise of the middle class brought new wealth, and with it, new approaches to domestic display. Department stores offered a wider range of furnishings and decorations, allowing families to adopt styles once reserved for the elite. At the same time, reform movements criticized the excess of decoration, calling for simpler and more healthful designs. By the 1890s, the aesthetic and arts and crafts movements began to challenge the heavy ornamentation of earlier Victorian interiors, reflecting a broader shift in cultural values. Yet the essential role of the drawing room as a stage for respectability and a space of female responsibility endured. The shadows it cast stretched far beyond its walls, shaping the lives of women across Britain. It symbolized both their authority and their confinement, their centrality to the family and their exclusion from society. The drawing room, with its polished surfaces and soft shadows, encapsulated the paradox of Victorian womanhood. It was a place where appearances defined reality, where silence carried as much weight as speech, and where every object and gesture was loaded with meaning. To step into a drawing room was to enter a world where nothing was accidental, and everything was performance. Behind the closed curtains, in the quiet spaces between conversation and ritual, countless women lived lives defined by these shadows. Lives of responsibility without recognition, of presence without power. In Victorian Britain, marriage was more than a personal union. It was a social contract, a financial arrangement, and a public declaration of respectability. For women, it was often the defining moment of their lives, determining not only their future security but their very identity. Love, while celebrated in poetry and novels, rarely stood alone as the foundation of marriage. Instead, alliances were built on family ambition, wealth, class, and the careful negotiation of appearances. The culture of Victorian marriage was shaped by legal structures that placed women in a position of dependence, until the Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882. A wife's earnings, inheritance, and possessions automatically became her husband's. In legal terms, her identity was absorbed into his. This doctrine, known as collapetia, meant that married women could not own property in their own name. sign contracts, or bring lawsuits independently. In effect, marriage turned women into legal minors, no matter their age or prior status. The social consequences were immense. For middle and upper class women, marriage was not simply desirable, it was essential. Unmarried women, often labeled spinsters, faced social marginalization. Their presence in households was tolerated, but rarely celebrated. Literature and popular culture portrayed them as pitiable or eccentric. Without the protection of marriage, women risked financial insecurity and social invisibility. The pressure to marry was therefore not merely emotional but existential. Courtship rituals reflected these high stakes. Meetings between unmarried men and women were carefully chaperoned, especially in the middle and upper classes. A walk in the garden, a seat beside each other at a dinner table, or a few minutes of private conversation could carry immense significance. Families watched closely, aware that reputations could be made or broken in these encounters. Letters between suitors were scrutinized, and even the exchange of gifts carried symbolic weight. The matchmaking process often extended beyond personal preference. Families arranged introductions, hoping to secure advantageous alliances. Wealth, land, and social standing were key considerations. The dowry system, though less formalized in Britain than in some European countries, remained an important factor. A woman's fortune could determine the suitability of a match, and marriages across class lines were rare. Even the language of marriage announcements in newspapers emphasized property, lineage, and respectability as much as affection. For working class women, the dynamics of marriage were shaped by different pressures. Economic survival often required two incomes, and women contributed through domestic labor, factory work, or service positions. Marriage offered companionship and shared responsibility, but it also reinforced patriarchal control. Husbands, legally, held authority over wives, and domestic violence, though criticized in reformist circles, was often dismissed as a private matter. Campaigns against wife-beating gained traction in the mid-19th century, reflecting growing recognition of the issue. But enforcement remained inconsistent. The double standard of morality further constrained women's lives. Adultery by a husband was socially tolerated, provided it did not cause scandal. Adultery by a wife, however, was considered a grave transgression, capable of destroying her reputation permanently. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, which introduced civil divorce courts, revealed this inequality. A husband could obtain a divorce on grounds of adultery alone, but a wife had to prove adultery combined with cruelty, desertion, or another serious offense. Divorce proceedings were public, with newspapers reporting lurid details that added humiliation to legal vulnerability. Despite these constraints, the Victorian period witnessed shifting attitudes toward love and romance. The ideal of companionate marriage, a partnership based on mutual affection as well as duty, gained cultural prominence. Novels by writers such as Charlotte Brontë and George Eliot portrayed heroines who sought love alongside respectability. Yet these narratives often highlighted the conflicts between personal desire and social expectations. To marry for love alone remained a risky path, particularly for women without independent means. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert embodied a model of affectionate marriage that influenced public perception. Their union, though dynastic in origin, was celebrated as a love match, and Victoria's devotion to Albert became a national ideal. Yet even this example underscored gender roles. Albert emphasized domestic virtue and female devotion, reinforcing the broader expectation that women's highest calling lay in marriage and motherhood. Marriage also structured the domestic economy. The husband was the legal provider, but the wife's role in managing the household was central. Middle-class women oversaw servants, budgets, and the education of children. Their unpaid labor sustained the home, which in turn sustained the appearance of respectability. Working-class wives carried even heavier burdens, balancing wage labor with child-rearing and domestic duties. In both cases, the institution of marriage bound women to roles that combined obligation with invisibility. Religious teachings reinforced these structures. Churches preached the sanctity of marriage and the duty of wives to obey their husbands. Sermons emphasized fidelity, modesty, and sacrifice, aligning spiritual authority with social norms. Religious ceremonies gave marriages divine legitimacy, but they also reinforced the gender hierarchy at the heart of Victorian domestic life. Yet within these boundaries, women sought agency. Some used marriage as a means of securing greater social mobility, leveraging alliances to elevate their families. Others engaged in subtle forms of resistance, negotiating more equal relationships with sympathetic husbands. The growing women's rights movement challenged the inequalities embedded in marriage, pressing for legal reforms and greater recognition of women's autonomy. Campaigners such as Barbara Lee Smith, Bodichon, and Caroline Norton highlighted the injustices of coverture and custody laws, sparking debates that eventually reshaped legislation. The cultural weight of marriage was evident in mourning practices as well. Widows occupied a unique position, bound by strict codes of dress and behavior, but also granted new freedoms. A widow could manage her own household, control her late husband's property if unencumbered, and even engage in business. Queen Victoria's prolonged mourning for Albert set an enduring example. But many widows used their position to carve out independence that had been denied during marriage by the late 19th century. The rise of feminist thought and suffrage movements challenged the notion that marriage was the only path for women. Debates over the new woman, educated, independent, and unwilling to marry solely for security, unsettled traditional norms. Writers such as Sarah Grand and Mona Caird argued that marriage, as structured, often oppressed women rather than liberated them. Their critiques reflected a growing recognition that love, freedom, and equality could not easily coexist within the Victorian marriage system. The reality, however, was that most women remained within the framework of bargains and constraints. For them, marriage continued to function as both a promise and a prison, offering security at the cost of autonomy, respectability at the cost of silence. The gilded cage extended into the home itself, its bars formed not only of etiquette and fashion, but of law and custom. To speak of Victorian marriage is to speak of transactions dressed in the language of devotion. Love existed, often deeply and sincerely, but it was filtered through structures that prioritized property, status, and control. In this sense, marriage was less a private bond than a public performance, a bargain struck in drawing rooms and sanctified in churches, binding women not only to husbands, but to an entire system of expectations. Behind the lace curtains, countless women navigated these bargains, some with resignation, others with quiet resistance. Their stories remind us that love in the Victorian age was never free from the shadow of rules, that even the most intimate of unions carried the weight of society's gaze. In Victorian Britain, the transmission of values, duties, and social roles did not primarily happen in schools or workplaces. It was woven quietly into the fabric of family life. passed from mothers to daughters in parlors, kitchens, and bedrooms. This intergenerational chain of expectations was one of the most powerful forces sustaining the Victorian order. Mothers were not only caretakers, they were custodians of tradition, teaching their daughters how to navigate the rules of propriety, how to present themselves respectably, and how to accept the roles society demanded. The prevailing ideology of the age was deeply rooted in the concept of domesticity. Coventry Patmore's 1854 poem, The Angel in the House, captured what many Victorians believed, that a woman's highest calling was to embody patience, devotion, and selflessness within the home. Mothers were expected to personify this ideal and to prepare their daughters to do the same. In practice, this meant passing down lessons not only in sewing, cooking, and housekeeping, but also in silence, restraint, and self-control. The mother-daughter bond in Victorian households was framed as both tender and disciplinary. Mothers were responsible for teaching girls how to conduct themselves in public, how to dress properly, and how to manage the subtleties of social interactions. A young girl's reputation began long before she reached adulthood. Her mother's vigilance shaped her future prospects. Failure to instill propriety could jeopardize a daughter's marriageability, reflecting not only on her, but on the entire family. Thus, women carried the burden of perpetuating the very rules that restricted them. Education for daughters reinforced this cycle. In middle and upper-class families, girls were taught accomplishments that would make them attractive in marriage markets. They learned to play the piano, draw landscapes, speak French, and recite poetry. These skills were not valued for their own sake, but for the charm they added to a young woman's presentation. Mothers oversaw these lessons, ensuring daughters were polished enough to entertain without being bold enough to overshadow men. In working-class households, the education of daughters was more practical. Mothers taught them to clean, cook, and stretch meager resources, preparing them for futures in domestic service or in managing modest homes of their own. The lessons extended beyond skill into morality. Victorian mothers were often tasked with instilling religious devotion in their children. Morning prayers, Sunday church attendance, and evening Bible readings were rituals that daughters were expected to carry into their adult lives. Women were viewed as moral guardians of the family, and mothers bore responsibility for transmitting these values. Any lapse in a daughter's conduct was seen as a reflection of her mother's failure. Discipline was an inseparable part of this. Inheritance. Girls were taught from an early age to sit quietly, to lower their voices, and to avoid drawing attention to themselves. Boisterousness, curiosity, or excessive independence were traits to be corrected, not encouraged. Many memoirs from the period recall the sting of maternal rebuke when a daughter spoke out of turn or displayed too much self-confidence. Mothers acted as the first enforcers of the architecture of rules, teaching daughters that survival depended on conformity. The dynamic was not without affection. Diaries and letters reveal the intimacy between many Victorian mothers and daughters, particularly in households where the father was distant or preoccupied. Mothers often served as confidants and advisors, guiding daughters through the uncertainties of adolescence, courtship, and marriage. Yet even this intimacy was bounded by expectations. A mother's counsel often emphasized patience, endurance, and submission, qualities that reinforced the broader system of restraint. The economic realities of the period deepened this chain of expectations. For middle-class families, securing advantageous marriages for daughters was often a financial necessity. A well-married daughter could elevate the family's status or relieve economic burdens. Mothers therefore carried immense responsibility in arranging introductions, coaching daughters on appropriate behavior, and managing their reputations. For working-class mothers, the priority was ensuring daughters could contribute to family survival, whether through wages, domestic service, or marriage to a stable partner. In both cases, daughters were trained to see their futures less as personal choices and more as extensions of familial duty. The cycle also shaped women's roles. Once daughters married, the expectations they had internalized were often enforced upon the next generation. Advice books, religious tracts, and popular magazines encouraged women to see this transmission of values as sacred duty. The Mother's Treasury and other guides published in the mid-19th century urged women to raise daughters who embodied modesty, industry, and deference. These texts reinforced the sense that mothers were gatekeepers of morality, tasked with reproducing social order one generation at a time. Not all women accepted these roles quietly. Some mothers questioned the limitations imposed on their daughters and sought to expand their opportunities. Reformers such as Emily Davies, who campaigned for women's higher education, or Josephine Butler, who fought for legal protections for women, were themselves mothers who resisted the narrow roles prescribed to their gender. Their advocacy reflected a recognition that the cycle of expectations could only be broken if mothers taught daughters to imagine alternatives. Nevertheless, resistance remained the exception rather than the rule. The majority of Victorian women upheld and reinforced the very structures that confined them. This was not necessarily out of agreement, but out of necessity. In a society where a woman's reputation determined her family's standing, mothers often had little choice but to train daughters in compliance. To raise a rebellious daughter was to risk scandal, poverty, and exclusion. In this sense, mothers were both victims and enforcers, trapped within the same gilded cage they passed on to their children. The emotional consequences of this cycle were profound. Many daughters recalled the weight of expectation with ambivalence, torn between affection for their mothers and resentment of the discipline imposed upon them. Some carried these lessons into adulthood with pride, viewing them as the foundation of respectability. Others, particularly in later decades as feminist ideas gained traction, began to critique their upbringing as a form of repression. The ambivalence of these legacies reveals the complexity of the mother-daughter bond in an era defined by appearances. By the late 19th century, the chain of expectations began to fray. The spread of education, the women's suffrage movement, and new career opportunities for women challenged traditional maternal roles. Young women increasingly sought independence through teaching, nursing, or office work, sometimes against their mother's wishes. The emergence of the new woman in literature and society reflected a generational shift, as daughters resisted the roles their mothers had prepared them for. Yet even in this moment of change, the old expectations lingered. Mothers continued to pass on lessons of propriety, even as daughters began to question them. The story of Victorian mothers and daughters is one of continuity and tension. It reveals how the structures of society were not only imposed from above, but reproduced within the intimate sphere of family life. The drawing rooms, schools, and churches of the age reinforced these lessons. But it was in the daily interactions between mothers and daughters that the architecture of rules was most deeply rooted. Behind the lace curtains of countless homes, mothers instructed daughters in the arts of silence, patience, and propriety. Whether through love, duty, or fear, they ensured the survival of a system that confined them both. The shadows of these expectations stretched across generations, binding women to roles they often did not choose, yet felt compelled to uphold. In Victorian Britain, education was not a neutral pursuit. For women, it was a question of identity, morality, and power. Knowledge could liberate, but it could also threaten the fragile balance of a society built on appearances and gendered restraint. The history of women's education in the 19th century is a story of whispers growing into voices, of cautious reforms pushing against entrenched fears, and of young women daring to learn in a world that warned them not to dot at the dawn. Of Queen Victoria's reign in 1837, female education was limited and heavily stratified by class. For the daughters of the aristocracy and middle classes, accomplishments dominated the curriculum. Piano playing, watercolor painting, French conversation, and embroidery were considered essential, not to foster independence, but to enhance marriageability. A young woman who could entertain politely at the piano or speak a few lines in French reflected well on her family. Intellectual rigor was unnecessary, even dangerous. To encourage serious study in mathematics or science was thought to risk undermining femininity. The fear of women's education was not only cultural but medical. Influential doctors argued that intellectual exertion threatened reproductive health. Edward Clarke's Sex in Education, 1873, widely read in both Britain and America, warned that the strain of study could damage the female body, particularly the uterus. Such theories framed education as a biological threat, discouraging families from encouraging their daughters to pursue higher learning. The body became a battleground where cultural anxieties about gender and power played out in scientific language. For working-class girls, education was even more restricted. Many left school by the age of 10 or 12, if they attended at all. Charity schools and Sunday schools provided basic literacy, but economic necessity often required daughters to contribute to family incomes through domestic service or factory work. The 1870 Elementary Education Act, which established school boards and compulsory attendance for children aged 5 to 13, marked a turning point. Yet even this reform often prioritized boys' education, while girls' schooling focused on sewing, cooking, and housekeeping. The message was clear: education should prepare women for service, not for independence. Despite these barriers, change began to stir in the mid-19th century. Reformers such as Mary Wollstonecraft, whose Vindication of the Rights of Woman 1792 predated the Victorian era but continued to resonate, provided intellectual foundations for later advocates. In the 1840s and 1850s, figures like Emily Davies and Elizabeth Garrett Anderson challenged the status quo. Davies campaigned for women's access to university-level education, arguing that intellectual capacity was not limited by gender. Anderson, who became the first woman to qualify as a physician in Britain in 1865, demonstrated by example that women could excel in professions traditionally reserved for men. The establishment of institutions for women marked a turning point. Queen's College, London, founded in 1848, and Bedford College, established in 1849, offered more rigorous academic training for women than had previously been available. These schools provided instruction in mathematics, history, and the sciences, moving beyond the ornamental accomplishments of earlier education. They also became centers for debate about women's roles, attracting both supporters and critics. Opponents warned that educated women would neglect their domestic duties, destabilize families, or become unmarriageable. Supporters countered: that education would make women better wives, mothers, and moral guides. Universities remained resistant. The ancient institutions of Oxford and Cambridge did not admit women to degrees until the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Yet progress was made in steps. In 1869, Emily Davies co-founded Girton College, Cambridge, the first residential college for women offering full university-level education. Newham College followed in 1871 at Oxford. Lady Margaret Hall and Somerville College opened in 1879. Women who studied there initially could not receive formal degrees, but their presence challenged centuries of exclusion. The struggle extended beyond higher education into the professions. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson and Sophia Jex-Blake campaigned for women to enter medicine. The Edinburgh Seven, a group of women led by Jex-Blake, who sought to study medicine at the University of Edinburgh in the 1860s, faced fierce opposition, including riots from male students who physically blocked their lectures. Though their efforts were initially thwarted, their persistence led to broader reforms that eventually opened medical education to women. Similar battles unfolded in law, academia, and civil service, where women had to prove repeatedly that intellectual ability was not confined to men. The expansion of women's education was closely tied to the wider women's rights movement. Campaigners for suffrage often argued that without education, women could not participate meaningfully in politics. Educational reform thus became both a symbol and a tool of broader liberation. Newspapers, pamphlets, and public lectures spread the message that women's minds deserved cultivation, not suppression. Yet, resistance remained powerful. Satirical cartoons depicted educated women as unfeminine, unattractive, or threatening to men. The figure of the blue stocking, once a term for intellectual women in the 18th century, became a Victorian caricature of pedantry and social awkwardness. Critics warned that education would make women neglect children, challenge husbands, or abandon domestic responsibilities. These anxieties reflected deeper fears that the passion of women's knowledge would destabilize the gender order itself. Religious institutions were divided on the issue. Some evangelical groups supported women's literacy for Bible study and missionary work, while others opposed higher education as contrary to women's God-given roles. The Church of England remained cautious, though individuals within its ranks supported reform. Missionary societies often trained women for teaching abroad, paradoxically granting them more independence overseas than at home. Working-class women also found ways to pursue learning outside formal institutions. Mechanics institutes, evening schools, and mutual improvement societies provided opportunities for self-education. Autobiographies of women workers reveal how some saved pennies to buy books or attended lectures after long shifts. Their determination underscores the hunger for knowledge that persisted despite systemic barriers. By the closing decades of the 19th century, progress was undeniable. The Education Act of 1870 had established the principle of compulsory schooling, even if unevenly applied. Women's colleges had taken root at major universities. Professional barriers, while not fully dismantled, were eroding. The first generation of university-educated women emerged, inspiring others to follow. Yet the battle was far from won. Social prejudice, economic limitations, and lingering fears of female intellect ensured that education remained contested ground. The story of Victorian women's education reveals the tension between silence and speech, restraint and ambition. For much of the century, knowledge was whispered rather than declared, pursued in the margins rather than the mainstream. But those whispers accumulated into a chorus that reshaped the landscape of opportunity. The chain of expectations that mothers passed to daughters was beginning to fray, challenged by the idea that women could be more than guardians of domesticity. Still, the struggle came at a cost. Many early pioneers faced ridicule, exclusion, or lifelong marginalization, yet their determination ensured that future generations would inherit a different world. By the dawn of the 20th century, the whispers of education had become voices demanding not only access to learning, but recognition of equality. Behind the lace curtains of drawing rooms and the heavy gates of universities, the battle for women's minds had been waged quietly, steadily, and irrevocably. Victorian Britain prided itself on order, respectability, and the visibility of virtue. Public life was carefully staged, drawing rooms curated, and reputations guarded with vigilance. Yet, behind the lace curtains of homes across the country, there existed another world, quieter, hidden, and far less constrained by the relentless gaze of society. Within these private spaces, women carved out lives of secrecy and imagination, cultivating small sanctuaries that allowed them to endure, and sometimes to resist, the weight of expectation. The drawing room, parlor, or bedroom often became the stage for these hidden lives. While these rooms symbolized conformity when visitors were present, in solitude they transformed into sites of quiet rebellion. Diaries, letters, and private journals were central to this interior world. For many Victorian women, writing was the only safe means of self-expression. Literacy had spread widely by the mid-19th century, and women seized the opportunity to put thoughts to paper, even if those thoughts contradicted public ideals. Journals recorded frustrations with marriage, longings for independence, and reflections on the restrictions of their age. Many of these documents, preserved in archives, reveal voices that were otherwise silenced in public. One striking example is the diary of Anne Lister, a Yorkshire landowner who wrote candidly about her romantic relationships with women. Though her life was unusual for its openness, her secret-coded diaries underscore how private writing created a hidden world where women could be honest in ways impossible in public. For others, such as the Brontë sisters, private writing nurtured creativity that eventually burst into the public sphere. Before Charlotte, Emily, and Anne Brontë published their novels, they filled notebooks with imaginary worlds, secret stories that allowed them to rehearse ideas of passion, ambition, and rebellion, long before they dared release them into the wider world. Reading formed another cornerstone of these hidden lives. Women consumed novels, poetry, and periodicals, not merely for leisure, but for escape and inspiration. Circulating libraries made books accessible to middle-class families, while cheaper serialized publications brought literature into working-class homes. Some texts reinforced social norms, but others opened windows onto alternative worlds. Works by George Eliot, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and even Charles Dickens offered glimpses of female characters who questioned or resisted convention. For many readers, fiction became a companion, a mirror, or even a subtle form of resistance. Female friendships flourished in these private spaces, often carrying an intensity that blurred the lines between companionship and romantic attachment. The Victorians themselves coined the phrase romantic friendship to describe close bonds between women that included passionate letters, physical affection, and lifelong devotion. While many such relationships were socially tolerated if framed as innocent, They also offered women emotional depth and intimacy beyond what patriarchal structures often allowed in marriage. The correspondence of women such as Eleanor Butler and Sarah Ponsonby, the so-called ladies of Llangollen, though slightly earlier than Victoria's reign, exemplified this tradition. In the Victorian period, countless less famous women nurtured similar bonds, hidden from public judgment behind the curtains of privacy. Art and handicraft also became outlets for these hidden lives. Embroidery, painting, and sketching were officially sanctioned as accomplishments. Yet in private, they often took on deeper meaning. Women embroidered secret messages, painted landscapes that reflected their inner states, or sketched studies of anatomy and botany that far exceeded the ornamental expectations of society. These creative practices provided an intellectual and emotional refuge, even if the results were never shared outside the household. For working-class women, hidden lives often took shape in moments stolen from exhausting routines. Letters written to family members, private conversations whispered after long shifts, and even songs sung quietly at home reflected emotions rarely acknowledged in the wider world. Many working-class women engaged in self-education through clandestine reading, borrowing books from friends or mechanics institutes. Their hidden lives revealed determination to carve out intellectual and emotional space despite crushing labor and poverty. Religion and spirituality also offered avenues of private retreat, while church attendance was a public performance of piety. Personal prayer and private devotions allowed women to cultivate spiritual identities beyond the scrutiny of clergy or neighbors. Some women were drawn to alternative spiritual practices, such as seances and spiritualism, which flourished in the mid to late 19th century. Spiritualism, in particular, gave women roles as mediums, granting them a voice and authority in settings where they were otherwise expected to remain silent. Behind closed doors, parlors were transformed into spaces where women claimed a power denied to them in conventional religious life. Secrecy also extended to matters of health and sexuality. The rigid morality of the Victorian age left little room for open discussion of women's bodies, reproductive health, or desire. Yet women exchanged advice privately through whispered conversations or carefully coded letters. Manuals on contraception, such as those published by Annie Besant and Charles Bradlaugh in the 1870s, circulated in defiance of obscenity laws. Though access was limited, the very existence of these materials points to hidden networks of knowledge through which women quietly sought control over their own bodies. Charitable work provided another paradoxical sphere of hidden lives. On the surface, philanthropy aligned perfectly with Victorian ideals of feminine selflessness. But in practice, many women used charitable activities as opportunities to step beyond domestic boundaries. Visiting the poor, teaching in schools, or organizing fundraising events allowed women to engage with the world in ways that often extended their influence. These roles, though framed as extensions of domestic duty, gave women experience in organization, leadership, and public speaking. In the shadows of charity, many cultivated skills that would later fuel activism and reform. The presence of servants within middle and upper-class households also created hidden dynamics. Domestic workers were expected to be invisible, operating behind the scenes to maintain the illusion of order and refinement. Yet they observed the realities behind appearances, witnessing family tensions, marital discord, and the pressures of respectability. Servants kept their own diaries and letters, some of which survive, offering glimpses of the hypocrisies of Victorian households. These records remind us that the hidden lives of women extended across class lines, shaped by proximity to and exclusion from the world of appearances. By the late Victorian period, the growth of women's clubs and societies formalized. Some of these hidden networks, literary clubs, debating societies, and suffrage organizations, provided spaces where women could gather outside the scrutiny of men. What began as whispers in private rooms expanded into collective voices calling for reform. The hidden lives of earlier decades laid the groundwork for public activism, transforming secrecy into solidarity. Still, secrecy never vanished. Many women continued to compartmentalize their lives, maintaining outward conformity while nurturing private selves in diaries, friendships, or creative work. The dual existence of Victorian women, public compliance and private expression, reveals the profound tension at the heart of the age. Respectability demanded silence, but human experience demanded voice. The hidden lives behind laced curtains were the compromise, allowing women to exist both within and against the constraints of their society. In hindsight, these private worlds were not marginal but central to Victorian history. They shaped literature, fostered reform, and sustained countless women whose public roles denied them recognition. Without the secret diaries, the whispered friendships, and the quiet creativity, the story of Victorian womanhood would be incomplete. The lace curtains that shielded these lives symbolized both protection and concealment. They softened the gaze of outsiders, allowing women moments of honesty and imagination. Yet they also reinforced the boundaries of private life, ensuring that much remained unseen. Behind them lay a world of complexity, resilience, and quiet defiance. The hidden lives of Victorian women. Respectability was the defining currency of Victorian Britain. It promised security, honor, and acceptance into polite society. For women, it was not simply a virtue, it was survival. But respectability was also fragile, easily lost, and often weaponized. It controlled choices, restricted freedoms, and condemned those who strayed, whether by choice or by circumstance. Behind the polished veneer of Victorian ideals lay a darker truth. The relentless pursuit of reputation destroyed lives as much as it preserved them. At its core, respectability in the 19th century was about appearances. To be respectable was to be seen as moral, modest, industrious, and properly domestic. The ideal was deeply gendered. Men were judged by professional success, financial stability, and public conduct. Women were judged by chastity, modest dress, religious devotion, and obedience to the rules of domesticity. A man could recover from scandal. A woman rarely could. The double standard was stark. A husband's infidelity might be whispered about, but was often excused as male weakness. A wife's suspected impropriety, however small, could end her social standing permanently. Divorce law codified this inequality. After the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, husbands could file for divorce on grounds of adultery alone. Wives had to prove adultery plus additional offenses such as cruelty, incest, or desertion. This imbalance left women trapped in marriages they could not escape without losing their reputations and often their children. Respectability was policed, not only through law but through community surveillance. Neighbors, acquaintances, and even servants played roles in monitoring behavior. A woman walking alone, a dress deemed too bold, or an overheard conversation could spark gossip. Once whispers spread, they were nearly impossible to erase. Victorian newspapers eagerly reported on scandals, particularly involving women of higher classes. Divorce court records were published in sensational detail, exposing private lives to public judgment. Respectability, while precious, was precarious. Working class women experienced respectability differently but no less harshly. For them, sobriety, industriousness, and family stability defined moral character. Women who failed to maintain clean homes, who drank excessively, or who bore children outside of marriage risked social exclusion. Philanthropic societies often reinforced these standards, offering aid only to the deserving poor, those who conformed to respectable ideals. Women who fell outside these categories were often abandoned to poverty or consigned to workhouses. The harshest judgments fell on the so-called fallen women. This category encompassed prostitutes, unmarried mothers, and women who lived outside the bounds of sexual respectability. Victorian society treated them as both moral threats and objects of pity. Campaigns such as the Magdalen Homes sought to reform prostitutes by training them in domestic service. But these institutions often imposed strict discipline, reflecting society's desire not to uplift women but to contain them. The Contagious Diseases Acts of the 1860s revealed the cruelty of this system, aimed at controlling venereal disease among soldiers. These laws allowed police to arrest women suspected of prostitution in garrison towns and subject them to invasive medical examinations. Men were not similarly policed. Activists like Josephine Butler led fierce campaigns against these acts, denouncing them as state-sanctioned abuse. Her success in repealing them in the 1880s marked one of the earliest victories of organized feminist activism. But not before countless women had suffered indignities in the name of public morality. Mourning customs further illustrate the suffocating grip of respectability. When a family member died, women were expected to display grief through elaborate rituals of dress and behavior. Widows in particular were bound by strict codes, wearing black for up to 2 years and refraining from social activities. Queen Victoria's lifelong mourning for Prince Albert became the national model. But for ordinary women, the burden was immense. Failure to observe mourning rituals risked accusations of coldness or impropriety. Respectability dictated not only how women lived, but how they grieved. Even charitable work, one of the few avenues for women to step outside domestic roles, was shaped by respectability. Philanthropy was considered suitable for women because it extended their domestic duty into the public sphere. Yet the women who benefited from charity were judged by strict moral standards. A single mother seeking aid might be denied if deemed immoral. Respectability was thus not only a personal burden but a tool of exclusion, dividing women into the worthy and unworthy. Respectability also intersected with class. Middle-class women bore the heaviest pressure to maintain appearances, as their status was precarious compared to the aristocracy. A single scandal could reduce a family's standing, undermine marriage prospects for daughters, and affect business relationships for sons and husbands. Working-class women, though less bound by drawing-room etiquette, still faced immense social judgment. Respectability functioned as a fragile shield against poverty and stigma, but it demanded conformity and silence in return. The pursuit of reputation infiltrated even the language of medical science. Diagnoses like hysteria or moral insanity were disproportionately applied to women who defied social expectations. Doctors claimed that improper behavior, such as sexual desire outside marriage or refusal to submit to husbands, reflected illness rather than autonomy. Medical authority thus reinforced social control, pathologizing resistance as disorder. Literature of the Victorian era frequently explored the dark side of respectability. In novels like Thomas Hardy's Tess of the d'Urbervilles 1891, female characters suffered devastating consequences for breaches of sexual morality, even when victimized by men. Elizabeth Gaskell's Mary Barton 1848 and George Eliot's Adam Bede 1859 similarly depict the social ruin of women accused of impropriety. These stories reflected real anxieties, dramatizing how one misstep could erase a woman's respectability permanently. The obsession with reputation extended into empire. British women abroad were scrutinized as symbols of national virtue. Their behavior was seen as reflective of the moral superiority of Britain itself. This placed an even heavier burden on women stationed in colonies, where any breach of propriety was interpreted not just as personal failure, but as national shame. Respectability, already suffocating at home, was magnified by imperial expectations. By the late 19th century, reform movements began to expose the cruelty of this system. Campaigners for women's rights highlighted the hypocrisy of double standards, the injustice of divorce law, and the abuses of the Contagious Diseases Acts. Writers like Mona Caird criticized marriage as a vexatious failure that imprisoned women under the guise of respectability. The rise of the new woman challenged the idea that female identity must be confined to appearances. Yet even as cracks appeared in the edifice of respectability, its shadow loomed large. For countless women, the obsession with reputation meant lives lived in fear. Fear of gossip, fear of scandal, fear of being labeled fallen. It meant silences where there might have been voices, compliance where there might have been resistance. Respectability promised protection, but it often delivered punishment. The dark side of Victorian respectability reveals the paradox of the age. In seeking to preserve moral order, society constructed a system that trapped women in cages of reputation, cages more enduring than iron bars. Victorian Britain was an empire built on labor. Factories thundered, ships carried goods across oceans, and railways stitched the nation together. Yet behind the noise of industry and the pomp of progress lay a vast army of women whose work remained largely invisible. Their labor, whether in homes, factories, fields, or streets, sustained the economy and upheld respectability, even as society insisted that women were unsuited for public life. To understand Victorian womanhood fully, one must look not only at drawing rooms and parlors, but at the places where women worked, often unseen and unacknowledged. The official ideology of the age proclaimed that a woman's place was in the home. The doctrine of separate spheres insisted that men belonged to the world of business, politics, and public affairs, while women belonged to the private realm of domesticity. But the reality of Victorian Britain defied this neat division. Millions of women worked, and their labor was indispensable. The contradiction between ideology and reality created a system where women's work was essential yet devalued, visible only when it served ideals of respectability. Domestic service was the single largest employer of women throughout the century. By mid-Victoria's reign, roughly 1 in 3 women in the workforce were servants. From kitchen maids to ladies' maids, cooks to housekeepers, they formed the backbone of middle and upper-class households. Service offered steady employment and board, but it also meant long hours, low pay, and little personal freedom. Servants lived under the watchful eyes of their employers, subject to curfews and constant regulation. Their labor was designed to be invisible. Meals prepared without fuss. Fires stoked before dawn. Rooms cleaned before families awoke. Respectable households depended on them, but their names rarely appeared in family records except as footnotes. In census forms, factory work drew hundreds of thousands of women into Britain's industrial centres. Textile mills in Lancashire and Yorkshire employed vast numbers of female workers, many starting in childhood. Women and girls tended spinning frames, looms, and machinery that demanded constant attention. Conditions were harsh, deafening noise, poor ventilation, and the ever-present risk of accidents. Pay was significantly lower than men's, reflecting the assumption that women's wages were supplementary even when entire families depended on them. Reformers like Lord Ashley, the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury, campaigned for factory regulations, and legislation such as the Factory Acts limited hours for women and children. Yet even these reforms often reinforced gender roles by emphasizing women's supposed fragility rather than their rights as workers. The match girls of London became one of the most visible examples of women's industrial labor. At the Bryant and May factory in the East End, young women worked with white phosphorus, which caused a debilitating condition known as phossy jaw. In 1888, they staged a strike demanding better pay and safer conditions. Their protest captured public attention and marked an early example of organized female labor activism, though often dismissed as powerless. Working women demonstrated that they could challenge exploitation and win improvements. In addition to factories, women filled roles in workshops, laundries, and the burgeoning service sector of shops and offices. The rise of department stores in the late 19th century created new opportunities for female shop assistants, though these positions came with long hours and constant scrutiny. Typing pools and clerical work also emerged as respectable employment for middle-class women, reflecting gradual shifts in attitudes toward women in the workplace. Yet these roles were carefully framed as extensions of domestic virtues, patience, neatness, and obedience, rather than as steps toward independence. Agricultural labor remained vital for rural women. They harvested crops, milked cows, and worked as gleaners, gathering leftover grain after harvest. Seasonal demand meant that women often combined field work with domestic responsibilities. Paintings by artists such as Jean-Francois Millet and writings by observers like William Cobbett highlight the physical intensity of rural women's work, though they rarely acknowledged its economic importance. Prostitution, though rarely acknowledged as labor, was an undeniable part of Victorian women's economic reality. Driven by poverty, lack of employment, or abandonment, many women turned to sex work for survival. Estimates suggest tens of thousands of prostitutes operated in London alone during the mid-19th century. Society condemned them as fallen women, yet their existence reflected structural inequalities. Campaigns like the Contagious Diseases Act exposed how the state criminalized women while ignoring men's complicity. For many, prostitution was not a moral failure, but a desperate form of labor in a system that left few alternatives. Even within the home, women's labor was relentless and undervalued. Middle-class wives managed households, oversaw servants, and ensured the family's respectability. Working-class wives juggled child-rearing, cooking, cleaning, and wage labor. The phrase double burden applied long before it was coined. Women's domestic work sustained families and communities, yet it was unpaid and unrecognized. Census categories often listed wives as having no occupation, erasing the reality of their daily toil. Charitable organizations and reform Movements both reflected and obscured women's labor. Middle and upper-class women engaged in philanthropy, teaching in schools, running soup kitchens, and organizing aid for the poor. These efforts were celebrated as extensions of feminine duty, yet they also allowed women to exercise organizational skills and leadership. Figures like Octavia Hill, who pioneered social housing reform, demonstrated how women's invisible labor could shape public life. Still, much of this work remained unpaid, sustained by the expectation that women's time and energy were naturally devoted to service. The invisibility of women's labor was reinforced by cultural representations. Literature and art often depicted women in domestic or ornamental roles, rarely acknowledging their economic contributions. When women workers did appear in novels, they were often portrayed as tragic figures, symbols of poverty or virtue. Lost. Charles Dickens, for instance, depicted seamstresses and milliners in precarious circumstances, highlighting their suffering but seldom presenting their work as dignified labor. This cultural framing obscured the fact that women's work was not exceptional but central to the functioning of Victorian society. By the late 19th century, cracks began to appear in this invisibility. Trade unions slowly opened their doors to women, and female-led organizations emerged to advocate for labor rights. The Women's Protective and Provident League, founded in 1874, sought to improve conditions for working women. Strikes by garment workers, match girls, and textile laborers demonstrated that women could organize collectively. These movements challenged both economic exploitation and cultural invisibility, laying groundwork for future labor activism. Education reforms also expanded opportunities for women's employment, as more girls attended schools after the 1870 Education Act. Teaching became a significant profession for women. By the end of the century, female teachers outnumbered males in elementary schools. Nursing, professionalized by Florence Nightingale after the Crimean War, became another respectable career path. These roles reflected a growing recognition of women's contributions, though they were still tied to ideals of nurturing and service. Despite these gains, the majority of women's labor remained unseen. Servants, laundresses, and mothers continued to form the hidden backbone of the economy. Their work was necessary but unacknowledged, essential but undervalued. The ideology of separate spheres masked this reality, sustaining the illusion that women were sheltered from labor even as their work surrounded every aspect of Victorian life. The story of women at work in Victorian Britain is one of paradox. They were told their place was in the home, yet they filled factories, fields, and shops. They were praised for modesty and obedience, yet they led strikes and demanded reform. Their work was everywhere, but their recognition was nowhere, invisible. Labor kept the wheels of society turning, even as society pretended it did not exist. Behind the lace curtains, in the smoke-filled factories, in the kitchens and laundries, women worked. Their labor sustained families, industries, and the empire itself. To ignore this reality is to misunderstand the Victorian world. The age may have celebrated invention and progress, but its foundations were built on invisible hands. The countless women whose work history nearly forgot. The Victorian era was an age of progress. Railways transformed landscapes, science reshaped knowledge, and medicine advanced with new discoveries. Yet for women, medicine often became another form of control. Theories of health and disease reinforced cultural ideals of fragility, turning illness into a framework for discipline. At the heart of this system lay hysteria, a diagnosis that silenced women by framing their resistance, emotions, and ambitions as medical disorders from the start of Victoria's reign in 1837. Women were described as naturally weaker, their bodies and minds shaped by reproductive function. Medical texts insisted that the uterus governed female health, linking nearly every symptom from fainting to anxiety, from fatigue to irritability to female troubles. The word hysteria itself derived from the Greek meaning uterus. This ancient connection carried into the 19th century, shaping the way doctors, families, and society interpreted women's behavior. Symptoms of hysteria were expansive and vague: headaches, insomnia, nervousness, mood swings, fainting spells, loss of appetite, or simply disobedience. Such elasticity made the diagnosis useful for reinforcing social order. A woman who resisted her prescribed role, who sought education, independence, or sexual freedom, could be labeled hysterical. The diagnosis medicalized dissent, transforming social conflict into individual pathology. Treatment often involved confinement and passivity. The rest cure, popularized by American physician Silas Weir Mitchell in the 1870s, required women to remain in bed for weeks or months, isolated from family and intellectual stimulation. They were forbidden from reading, writing, or engaging in conversation. Instead, they were fed rich diets and subjected to enforced idleness. While intended to restore health, the rest cure often deepened despair, as women deprived of activity, an expression deteriorated psychologically. Charlotte Perkins Gilman's 1892 short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, though American, captured this experience vividly, describing a woman driven to break down under such treatment. Not all medical practices were so extreme, but many reinforced the same principle: silence. Doctors prescribed sedatives for nervousness, tonics for weakness, and even surgical interventions. Removal of ovaries was occasionally recommended for hysterical women, justified by the belief that reproductive organs caused mental instability. Gynecological surgeries performed without anesthesia or consent were not uncommon, reflecting both limited medical ethics and deep-seated misogyny. The culture of fragility extended beyond hysteria. Women were routinely warned against education on the grounds that study would damage their health. Edward Clarke's Sex in Education, 1873, argued that intellectual exertion diverted energy from reproductive organs, risking infertility. Though controversial, his ideas influenced both parents and policymakers, reinforcing the belief that women's minds and bodies were unsuited to rigorous learning. Middle and upper-class women were most affected by these medical constructions, as their lives were closely monitored for signs of delicacy. Fainting couches and smelling salts became cultural symbols of feminine fragility. Yet working-class women, despite equally demanding health challenges, rarely received the same diagnoses. Their labor in factories and fields was often ignored. In medical discourse, reinforcing class as well as gender divides, respectable women were fragile. Working women were expected to endure. Mental illness, too, was shaped by gendered interpretations. Women were disproportionately admitted to asylums, often for reasons rooted in social conflict rather than medical necessity. A wife who disobeyed her husband, a daughter who resisted authority, or a mother deemed neglectful could be institutionalized. Once confined, women faced harsh conditions and limited chances of release. The asylum, like the rest cure, became a tool of social discipline, enforcing silence on those who challenged norms. At the same time, Cultural fascination with female illness shaped literature and art. Pale, delicate heroines appeared in novels, embodying ideals of beauty intertwined with fragility. Tuberculosis, or consumption, was romanticized as a disease of refinement, with its wasting effects seen as ethereal. Opera, poetry, and painting celebrated the tragic beauty of the sick woman, reinforcing associations between femininity and weakness. Yet women also challenged these narratives. Reformers and writers exposed the dangers of medical control. Florence Nightingale, though herself often described as delicate, used her authority to professionalize nursing and challenge medical complacency. Campaigners for women's education refuted claims of biological inferiority, citing the success of women in universities as evidence of resilience. Patients themselves sometimes resisted, refusing treatment or exposing abuses through letters and memoirs. By the late Victorian period, medical science began shifting. Neurology and psychiatry emerged, reframing hysteria as a nervous disorder rather than a uterine disease. Pioneers like Jean-Martin Charcot in Paris studied hysteria with clinical detail, though his public demonstrations of women's seizures often bordered on spectacle. In Britain, debates over women's health increasingly reflected broader social changes. As the women's movement gained strength and education reforms expanded, still, the legacy of hysteria remained. For countless women, illness was not merely a medical condition but a social judgment. The diagnosis of fragility justified confinement, silence, and control. It blurred the line between health and morality, treating resistance as sickness and independence as disorder. The Victorian obsession with female delicacy reminds us that medicine is never neutral. It reflects the values and fears of its time. In the 19th century, those fears were directed toward women who threatened to step beyond prescribed roles. Illness became a language through which society enforced silence, turning bodies into battlegrounds for control. Behind the lace curtains, countless women endured treatments that confined them further, their voices dismissed as symptoms rather than truths. Their silence was not natural but imposed, the dark consequence of a culture that feared their strength as much as their weakness. Religion was one of the most powerful forces in Victorian life, shaping morality, politics, and family structures. For women, it carried particular weight. Faith reinforced expectations of obedience, modesty, and domesticity, binding women to roles defined by morality and submission. Yet religion also offered escape, a language of devotion that gave women spiritual authority, and in some cases, opportunities for independence beyond the home. The story of Victorian faith is therefore one of paradox, control on the one hand, liberation on the other. The Church of England dominated religious life, supported by evangelical revival movements that emphasized personal piety and strict morality. Sermons, tracts, and prayer books reinforced ideals of female virtue. Women were encouraged to see themselves as angels in the house, guardians of morality through prayer, Bible study, and devotion. Motherhood was framed as a sacred duty, with mothers responsible for the spiritual as well as physical upbringing of children. Evangelicalism reinforced the idea that women's influence lay not in public life but in shaping souls within the family. Manuals instructed wives to be submissive yet prayerful, guiding husbands gently toward virtue without overt authority. Daughters were taught that obedience was a form of religious devotion. Faith and family life were thus intertwined, binding spiritual duty to domestic responsibility. Yet the same emphasis on morality gave women roles that extended beyond the home. Charitable work, missionary activity, and Sunday school teaching were considered acceptable extensions of feminine duty. By mid-century, thousands of women were engaged in teaching Bible classes, organizing charitable societies, and visiting the sick. These roles provided a measure of independence, allowing women to move in public spaces and develop organizational skills, though always under the banner of religious service. Mourning practices further tied women to religious roles. Death was interpreted through a Christian framework, and women were expected to model piety in grief. Queen Victoria's extended mourning for Prince Albert became a national symbol of religious devotion as much as personal loss. In ordinary families, widows were tasked with preserving moral order during bereavement, embodying faith in the face of sorrow. At the same time, religion deepened fears of female transgression. Women accused of sexual impropriety were not only shamed socially, but condemned spiritually. Religious rhetoric framed fallen women as sinners in need of redemption. Rescue homes and reform institutions often emphasized repentance and prayer as conditions for rehabilitation. While some women embraced these paths, others experienced them as coercive. Another layer of control masked as salvation. Alternative spiritual practices offered a different kind of escape. Spiritualism, which flourished in Britain from the 1850s onward, gave women unusual authority. Mediumship, the practice of communicating with spirits, was dominated by women who were believed to be more sensitive and receptive. Seances held in parlors across Britain transformed domestic spaces into sites of female power, where women's voices carried authority rarely allowed in churches. While critics dismissed spiritualism as superstition or fraud, it gave many women an outlet for self-expression and leadership. Catholicism, nonconformism, and other denominations also provided varied experiences. Convents and sisterhoods gave women spaces for community and service outside marriage, particularly during the revival of Anglican sisterhoods in the mid-19th century. Methodist and Quaker traditions allowed greater female participation in preaching and leadership. These religious alternatives challenged the monopoly of the Church of England and offered some women more active roles. Fear was as central as faith. Sermons warned of damnation, tracts described the dangers of immorality, and missionary societies portrayed the world outside Britain as spiritually dark. Women were often depicted as both vulnerable to sin and responsible for preventing it. In others, this dual message deepened the weight of expectation. To fail in morality was not only a personal lapse, but a spiritual betrayal. Literature reflected the pervasive influence of religion. Novels, such as Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South, 1855, depicted women navigating the tensions between faith, duty, and independence. Religious imagery permeated poetry and sermons, reinforcing the moral framework that shaped women's lives. Yet writers like George Eliot, herself a critic of organized religion, exposed the limitations of faith when it became a tool of repression rather than liberation. By the end of the century, religion remained central but contested. The rise of biblical criticism, Darwin's theory of evolution, and secular reform movements challenged traditional beliefs. Women increasingly sought roles in public activism that extended beyond religious frameworks. Yet the habits of faith endured. Prayer, devotion, and moral responsibility remained deeply woven into daily life. For many women, faith was both chain and refuge. It demanded obedience, yet offered solace, reinforced silence, yet gave voice, bound them to roles, yet opened doors to service. Spiritual life in Victorian Britain was not monolithic but complex, shaped by fear as much as by hope. Behind the laced curtains of homes and in the candlelit parlors of sponsors, women turned to faith, whether traditional or alternative, as a way to endure, to find meaning, and sometimes to claim power. Religion remained one of the most powerful forces shaping their world, binding them to ideals, while quietly offering paths of escape. In the Victorian world, love was celebrated in poetry, novels, and art, yet real desire, particularly when it transgressed social boundaries, was shrouded in silence. Behind the lace curtains of homes and in the shadows of society, women experienced longings and attachments that clashed with the rigid codes of respectability. Forbidden loves, whether across class, within same-sex relationships, or outside the confines of marriage, revealed the tension between private passion and public. Morality, marriage, was promoted as the only respectable context for intimacy. Religious teaching, legal structures, and social norms all reinforced this message. Yet the reality was more complicated. Loveless marriages, arranged unions, and strict gender roles often left women unfulfilled. Diaries and private letters show how women turned to secret relationships, forbidden affections, or quiet fantasies as outlets for emotions that could not be openly expressed. Class boundaries created some of the most visible taboos. A middle or upper-class woman who fell in love with a working-class man risked scandal, as such unions threatened family, honor, and inheritance structures. Novels such as Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South dramatized these tensions, though always carefully resolving them within acceptable limits. In real life, many women suppressed or sacrificed love to preserve family reputation. When they did not, consequences could be severe: estrangement, financial ruin, or lifelong scandal. Same-sex relationships existed in forms both intimate and hidden. Romantic friendships between women were common and often socially tolerated when framed as innocent. Women exchanged passionate letters, shared households, and expressed devotion in terms that today might be read as romantic or even erotic. The diaries of Anne Lister, already mentioned in earlier chapters, reveal a candid record of same-sex love in early 19th century England. Later in the century, women like poet Michael Field, the pseudonym of Catherine Bradley, and Edith Cooper, lived openly as romantic partners within literary circles, though their work was often overshadowed by scandalized whispers. The taboo around female desire was reinforced by medicine as well as morality. Victorian doctors often denied or ignored the existence of female sexuality outside reproduction. Manuals described women as naturally passive, with little or no sexual appetite. To express desire was to risk being labeled deviant, hysterical, or immoral. Yet evidence from private writings and court records reveals that women did feel and pursue sexual longing, often at great personal risk. Adultery was one of the most destructive taboos. A woman discovered in an extramarital relationship faced ruin. Divorce courts exposed such cases to public scrutiny, with newspapers eagerly reporting lurid details. Men might recover from scandal, women rarely did. The tragic case of Lady Caroline Norton illustrates the dangers. Though separated from her abusive husband, she was legally unable to divorce him or gain custody of her children. Rumors of impropriety haunted her reputation, despite her later achievements as a reformer. Her story underscores how accusations of forbidden love could destroy a woman's social standing regardless of truth. Sexuality itself was regulated through silence. Discussions of contraception were suppressed under obscenity laws, and even medical information about reproduction was limited. Yet women quietly circulated knowledge, purchasing pamphlets or seeking advice from reformers like Annie Besant, who in 1877 was tried for publishing materials on birth control. Her defense highlighted how women's health and autonomy were undermined by enforced ignorance, revealing how taboo extended not only to desire but to knowledge itself. Art and literature both reflected and reinforced these taboos. While novels often punished female characters who pursued forbidden loves, Tess in Thomas Hardy's Tess of the d'Urbervilles, or Hetty Sorrel in George Eliot's Adam Bede, they also exposed the cruelty of a system that left women little room for choice. Poetry, meanwhile, provided a more private outlet. Elizabeth Barrett Browning's sonnets from the Portuguese celebrated passionate love within marriage. But many lesser-known women poets hinted at longings that could not be openly declared. The Empire magnified these tensions. British women living abroad were scrutinized as embodiments of national virtue. Relationships with local men were condemned as betrayal, reflecting not only personal taboo but imperial anxieties. Colonial courts and missionary societies reported cases of improper attachments with moral outrage, reinforcing how deeply forbidden love was tied to the preservation of power structures. Despite the risks, women continued to form attachments that defied convention, whether in secret friendships, coded letters, or quiet acts of defiance. They carved out spaces where desire could be acknowledged, however fleetingly. These hidden loves remind us that beneath the strict moral codes of Victorian Britain lay a world of passion, risk, and resilience. Love in the Victorian age was never free from the weight of rules. Forbidden loves did not simply break hearts. They revealed the fragility of a system that demanded silence and conformity at any cost. Not all Victorian women accepted the constraints of respectability. Some resisted quietly through diaries or secret friendships. Others rebelled openly, challenging laws, institutions, and expectations. These women, writers, reformers, suffragists, and activists, did not merely survive within the gilded cage. They rattled its bars, and, in some cases, helped tear them down. Their defiance earned ridicule, hostility, and sometimes punishment, but it also laid the foundations for change. The mid-19th century saw the rise of organized reform. Figures like Caroline Norton fought for legal rights in marriage and child custody. After her separation from her abusive husband in the 1830s, Norton discovered she had no legal rights to her children or earnings. Her campaigning led to the Custody of Infants Act 1839 and the Married Women's Property Acts 1870 and 1882, which began to dismantle coverture. Norton's struggles revealed how personal injustice could fuel broader reform, inspiring other women to demand change. Writers wielded the pen as a weapon of rebellion. The Brontë sisters, publishing under male pseudonyms in the 1840s, challenged literary conventions with heroines who resisted passivity. Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre gave voice to female independence, insisting on moral and emotional equality. In love, George Eliot Mary Ann Evans defied social expectations not only through her work but through her personal life. Living with philosopher George Henry Lewes outside marriage, her novels depicted women grappling with ambition, desire, and constraint, offering narratives that questioned Victorian ideals. Activists targeted sexual double standards. Josephine Butler's campaign against the contagious diseases acts exemplified female rebellion against state power. Beginning in the 1860s, she led a movement of women who denounced the laws as degrading and unjust. Facing public hostility and personal danger, Butler insisted that the state had no right to police women's bodies while excusing men's behavior. Her efforts succeeded in repealing the acts in the 1880s, marking a landmark victory for women's activism. Dress reformers also challenged conventions. Amelia Bloomer in the United States inspired British women to adopt rational dress, looser garments and trousers that freed women from the physical restrictions of corsets and crinolines. Though mocked as unfeminine, the Rational Dress Society, founded in 1881, reflected growing awareness that fashion was political. Clothing could symbolize either conformity or rebellion, and women who altered their dress confronted ridicule in public but inspired admiration among reformers. The suffrage movement emerged as the most visible form of rebellion. Early campaigners like Lydia Becker and Millicent Fawcett argued for women's right to vote as a matter of justice and equality. The suffrage cause gained momentum through petitions, public meetings, and publications, though full voting rights would not be achieved until the 20th century. The Victorian suffrage campaigns laid essential groundwork. The very act of women speaking publicly on political matters defied norms of silence, making every meeting a form of rebellion. Education pioneers fought for intellectual freedom. Emily Davies, founder of Girton College, insisted that women deserved the same rigorous education as men. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson and Sophia Jex-Blake forced open the doors of medical training, confronting riots and institutional resistance. These rebels did not simply demand access for themselves. They fought to create institutions that would outlast them, ensuring that future generations of women could claim rights denied to their mothers. Even art and leisure became sites of resistance. Women who cycled, played tennis, or participated in clubs defied the image of fragile femininity. The bicycle, in particular, became a symbol of liberation, granting women physical mobility and independence. Critics decried it as dangerous or indecent, but reformers embraced it as a tool of freedom. The empire provided another arena for rebellion. Some British women missionaries used their roles abroad to gain independence they could not claim at home. Others, like writer Flora Tristan, linked women's rights to labor reform and international struggles. Their actions revealed that rebellion was not confined to Britain but connected to global movements for justice. Rebellion came at a cost. Women who defied norms were often ridiculed as unsexed, unfeminine, or unnatural. Satirical cartoons mocked suffragists as shrill spinsters or domineering wives. Activists endured threats, assaults, and isolation. Yet they persisted, often motivated by the conviction that their struggles were not only personal but generational. By the close of the 19th century, the rebels in petticoats had reshaped the landscape of possibility. Laws had begun to change, universities had opened their doors, and the suffrage movement was gaining strength. Respectability still loomed large, but it no longer seemed unbreakable. The courage of those who resisted had shown that even within the tightest constraints, rebellion was possible. The rebels remind us that history is not only shaped by institutions and laws, but by individuals who refused to be silent. Their petticoats may have marked them as Victorian women, but their defiance marked them as pioneers of change. Rebellion in Victorian Britain was rarely without consequence. For women who challenged the codes of respectability, the penalties were severe. social ostracism, financial ruin, legal punishment, or lifelong stigma. To defy expectations was to risk being marked as unnatural, fallen, or dangerous. The history of rebellion is therefore also a history of cost, measured not only in victories gained but in lives scarred. Consider the case of Caroline Norton. Her defiance was not in scandalous behavior, but in refusing to accept the injustices of marriage law. After separating from her abusive husband in the 1830s, she discovered she had no legal claim to her earnings as a writer and no custody rights to her children. Her campaign for reform led to the Custody of Infants Act, 1839, and the Married Women's Property Acts, 1870, 1882. Yet the personal cost was immense. She endured slander, financial instability, and lifelong strain, even as her efforts paved the way for future generations. For activists like Josephine Butler, the cost was public vilification. Her campaign against the Contagious Diseases Acts in the 1860s and 1870s exposed her to ridicule and threats. Newspapers portrayed her as a fanatic meddler, while hecklers disrupted her speeches. Yet Butler persevered, insisting that laws targeting women while excusing men were an affront to justice. Her reputation suffered during her lifetime, though. History now remembers her as a pioneer of reform. Writers also bore the weight of defiance. George Eliot Mary Ann Evans lived openly with philosopher George Henry Lewes, defying marital conventions. The choice cost her acceptance in polite society, even as her novels gained critical acclaim. Her literary genius could not entirely shield her from stigma. Similarly, early suffragists faced accusations of abandoning femininity. Satirical cartoons mocked them as shrill, unattractive, or domineering, reinforcing the idea that rebellion required women to sacrifice desirability and respectability alike. The law itself punished rebels. Divorce cases exposed women's private lives to public scrutiny. A wife accused of adultery lost not only her marriage but her reputation and often her children. Women who sought separation on grounds of cruelty or neglect faced grueling trials, with judges and juries predisposed against them. Those who transgressed sexual norms could be cast out of families, denied financial support, and reduced to poverty. For working-class women, the costs were even harsher. Loss of employment, exclusion from communities, and confinement in workhouses. Prostitutes and unmarried mothers bore the brunt of these punishments. Labeled as fallen, they were excluded from respectability, often without hope of return. Reform institutions like Magdalen homes offered rehabilitation, but only through strict discipline and labor. Many women disappeared into poverty. Their rebellion against sexual codes, whether chosen or imposed by circumstance, punished by lifelong exclusion. Medical costs were also imposed on rebellious women. Those who sought education or careers were warned of physical harm, accused of endangering their health or fertility. Some were subjected to invasive treatments or confinement in asylums. The diagnosis of hysteria, as explored earlier, functioned as a weapon against women whose ambitions threatened the social order. Even in victory, costs endured. Early female doctors such as Elizabeth Garrett Anderson and Sophia Jex Blake overcame immense opposition. But their paths were marked by hostility, exclusion, and financial barriers. They bore the burden of representing all women with any misstep, used as evidence against female capability. Their successes opened doors, but at the price of personal hardship. The emotional costs of rebellion were profound. Letters and diaries reveal the isolation many rebels endured. Estranged from families, mocked by neighbors, or excluded from polite circles, they lived with loneliness as the price of principle. Some, like the suffragists, who endured imprisonment and force-feeding in later decades, sacrificed health and well-being for the cause. In the Victorian period, even lesser acts of rebellion carried risks that left scars both visible and invisible. And yet, rebellion continued. The willingness of women to endure these costs testifies to the depth of injustice they faced. For many, silence was simply more unbearable than stigma. Their sacrifices illuminate not only the cruelty of Victorian constraints, but the resilience of those who challenged them. The cost of rebellion was measured in reputations ruined, families fractured, and futures foreclosed. But it was also measured in progress, reforms achieved, barriers broken, and new possibilities imagined. Without those who paid the price, the gilded cage might have remained unshaken. For every rebel who defied Victorian norms, there were countless others who did not. Women who endured in silence, bound by expectations they could not escape. Their lives rarely appeared in newspapers, novels, or history books, yet they represented the vast majority, sustaining the structures of respectability even as they bore its burdens. These silent masses reveal the everyday reality of Victorian womanhood, where conformity was survival and rebellion a dangerous luxury. Most Victorian women lived lives shaped by marriage, motherhood, and domestic labor. Census data from the mid-19th century shows that the majority of women worked in some capacity, but their roles were framed within or adjacent to the household. Servants, seamstresses, laundresses, governesses, and wives filled roles essential to society but seldom recognized as significant. For them, silence was not necessarily choice but necessity. To question roles openly could mean unemployment, social disgrace, or familial rejection. The ideology of separate spheres, though contested by reformers, was internalized by many women. Advice manuals, sermons, and educational materials reinforced the message that obedience and modesty were virtues. Girls raised in this environment often came to see silence as natural. Their ambitions narrowed before they could imagine alternatives. For middle-class daughters, the goal was marriage. For working-class daughters, survival. Both paths demanded compliance. Respectability functioned as a constant form of surveillance. Women were taught to guard their reputations at all costs, for their futures depended on it. Silence became a form of self-defense, a shield against gossip and scandal. Diaries from ordinary women often contain little beyond household tasks and prayers, reflecting both limited opportunities and the fear of saying too much. Silence was not only imposed from outside, but internalized, shaping self-expression itself. The cost of this silence was profound. Many women endured abusive marriages without recourse, their voices dismissed in courts or communities. Domestic violence, though acknowledged, was often excused as private. Working-class women who suffered poverty or exploitation had few avenues to protest. Their struggles remained hidden in slums, factories, and workhouses, while public attention focused on the scandals of the elite. Religion deepened this culture of silence. Churches taught women to bear suffering with patience, framing endurance as spiritual virtue. Charity organizations reinforced moral judgments, rewarding the deserving poor while condemning those who faltered. Women learned to conceal hardship, presenting an image of respectability even when their lives were marked by hunger, illness, or despair. The silent masses also reveal the limitations of reform. While pioneers fought for rights in education, law, and suffrage, many women remained untouched by these changes during their lifetimes. Factory acts limited hours but did not end exploitation. Education acts expanded schooling but often prioritized boys. Suffrage campaigns raised awareness but left most women without political voice until the 20th century. For the majority, daily reality remained unchanged. Silence in the face of necessity. Yet silence did not always mean consent. Subtle acts of resistance existed within the quiet. A servant hiding food for herself, a factory worker slowing her pace, or a mother secretly teaching her daughter to read beyond her lessons. These were forms of defiance that left no public record. The silent masses may not have joined marches or written manifestos, but they carried resilience in small acts that preserved dignity against overwhelming odds. Literature occasionally captured glimpses of these lives. Elizabeth Gaskell's Mary Barton portrayed working-class struggles with rare empathy, while diaries of ordinary women, preserved by chance, revealed the endurance of those who never sought recognition. These fragments remind us that silence was not emptiness but survival, the unrecorded foundation upon which Victorian society rested. By the end of the 19th century, silence began to fracture. The spread of education, urbanization, and political movements gave some women greater voice. Yet the legacy of the silent masses endured. They remained the invisible majority, whose conformity upheld the very structures reformers sought to dismantle. The history of Victorian womanhood cannot be told without them. Their silence sustained respectability, their labor sustained families, and their endurance sustained communities. If rebels rattled the bars of the gilded cage, the silent masses lived within it day after day, unseen and unheard. By the final decades of the Victorian age, the great edifice of appearances, the lace curtains, the gilded cages, the architecture of rules, was beginning to fracture. What once seemed immovable now showed cracks. Industrialization, urbanization, education, and reform had altered Britain's social fabric, and women increasingly found ways to step through the gaps. Though the structures of respectability remained powerful, they were no longer absolute. One of the most significant forces behind this change was education. The founding of women's colleges at Oxford and Cambridge, along with the gradual opening of professional schools, created a generation of women who possessed intellectual tools their mothers had been denied. By the 1880s, women were studying medicine, law, and science, though often in segregated institutions or without the right to graduate with formal degrees. Emily Davies's Girton College at Cambridge and Elizabeth Garrett Anderson's London School of Medicine for Women became symbols of these cracks. Their graduates went on to challenge stereotypes of female fragility, demonstrating competence and resilience in fields once closed to them. Employment opportunities also widened, though unevenly. The typewriter and the expansion of clerical work created positions for middle-class women as typists and secretaries. Teaching and nursing emerged as respectable professions, granting women limited independence and incomes. The 1870 Elementary Education Act fueled this trend, as schools needed teachers, most of them female. Florence Nightingale's professionalization of nursing after the Crimean War elevated a role once considered menial into a respected career. Each step into the workforce chipped away at the ideology of separate spheres. The suffrage movement added further cracks. though the vote would not be won until the 20th century. Campaigns in the late Victorian period brought women into public life in unprecedented ways. Petitions, rallies, and speeches revealed not only demands for political rights, but also the capacity of women to organize and lead. Millicent Facet's, constitutional suffragists, and Lydia Becker's campaigns for municipal voting rights gave the cause momentum, demonstrating that silence was no longer inevitable. Social reform movements also expanded women's influence. Josephine Butler's success in repealing the Contagious Diseases Acts in 1886 marked a turning point. The campaign revealed how women could confront the state directly, mobilizing moral outrage to challenge laws that targeted them. Octavia Hill's work in housing reform, Barbara Lee Smith, Bodichan's advocacy for property rights, and Frances Power Cobbe's campaigns against domestic violence all reflected new forms of activism. These efforts did not dismantle the entire system of respectability, but they exposed its contradictions and limitations. Literature played a vital role in spreading these cracks. The emergence of the new woman in fiction symbolized cultural anxieties and aspirations. Writers such as Sarah Grand, Mona Caird, and Olive Schreiner depicted women who sought independence, education, and fulfillment outside traditional roles. Newspapers debated whether the new woman was a threat to morality or a symbol of progress. Cartoons mocked her as bicycle riding, cigarette smoking, and marriage rejecting. Yet the very ridicule confirmed that she had become a cultural force. Technology and leisure also contributed. The bicycle, affordable by the 1890s, gave women unprecedented mobility. Critics decried it as dangerous to health and morality, but women embraced it as liberation. Cycling skirts and bloomers challenged fashion norms, while the act of riding blurred boundaries between private and public life. Photography, meanwhile, offered women opportunities both as consumers and practitioners. The camera allowed them to capture family life, while professional photographers such as Julia Margaret Cameron gained recognition for their artistry. Even within the domestic sphere, cracks appeared. The spread of household technology, improved stoves, mass-produced goods, and running water in some urban homes reduced the burden of housework. While domestic labor remained demanding, these innovations shifted expectations. Women increasingly questioned whether their talents were best confined to the home. Working-class women, long accustomed to wage labor, found in urban networks of solidarity ways to resist exploitation. Religion, too, faced challenges. While many women remained devout, the rise of secularism, biblical criticism, and scientific discoveries undermined old certainties. Darwin's On the Origin of Species, 1859, sparked debates that unsettled religious authority. Some women embraced new spiritual movements, such as theosophy or spiritualism, which offered roles of leadership and independence denied in traditional churches. These alternative faiths reflected both dissatisfaction with old structures and the search for new meaning. Imperial expansion also created cracks, though British women abroad often reinforced ideals of respectability, but they also encountered different cultures and gained experiences that reshaped their sense of identity. Missionaries, travelers, and colonial wives sometimes found themselves acting with greater autonomy than they might at home. Their stories reveal how empire, while oppressive, also opened unintentional spaces for women to test boundaries. Yet these cracks provoked backlash. Conservative voices warned that women's increasing visibility threatened family stability and moral order. Medical authorities continued to warn against the dangers of education or overwork. Critics of the new woman mocked her as unfeminine, unnatural, and unlovable. Satirical magazines portrayed her as a threat to marriage and motherhood. The very existence of cracks in the system provoked fear, underscoring how deeply respectability was still entrenched. Still, by the end of Victoria's reign in 1901, change was undeniable. Women had entered professions, gained legal rights to property, organized politically, and challenged fashion, literature, and morality. The cage had not been broken, but it was no longer seamless. Through education, work, activism, and culture, women had carved fissures in the architecture of rules, proving that even the most rigid structures could not endure unaltered. Behind the lace curtains, the cracks widened. The shadows of silence gave way to voices, and the edifice of respectability began to tremble. When Queen Victoria died in 1901, the world she had presided over for more than 6 decades came to an end. Yet the struggles, silences, and rebellions of Victorian women did not disappear. They left echoes that reverberated into the 20th century and beyond. To trace these echoes is to understand how the hidden lives behind lace curtains shaped the freedoms of later generations. The most immediate legacy was the suffrage movement. Victorian campaigns for property rights, education, and legal reform laid the foundations for political activism in the Edwardian era. By 1918, some British women won the right to vote. By 1928, all women over 21 gained full suffrage. This victory was not sudden but built on decades of Victorian pioneers who had endured ridicule and hostility for demanding rights. The echoes of their efforts rang loudly in parliaments, rallies, and ballot boxes. The fight for education continued to resonate. Women's colleges founded in the Victorian period expanded, and universities gradually granted full degrees. Professions once barred to women opened more widely in the 20th century. Medicine, law, and academia saw increasing numbers of women, thanks to the cracks carved by pioneers like Anderson, Blake, and Davies. Each female graduate in the 20th century echoed the struggles of those who had fought for entry in the 19th. The cultural archetype of the new woman also left a lasting imprint. Though ridiculed in its time, the figure of an independent, educated, and ambitious woman became a template for modern feminism. Early 20th century campaigns for equal pay, reproductive rights, and sexual freedom all drew upon the language of independence that first emerged in Victorian fiction and activism. Even today, debates over gender roles echo Victorian anxieties about the balance between family and independence. The legacy of silence also endured. For many women, Victorian respectability continued to shape family expectations well into the 20th century. Stories of mothers and grandmothers who endured abusive marriages, concealed illnesses, or suppressed ambitions remind us that the cage did not vanish overnight. Yet the memory of this silence became a rallying point for later generations, determined not to repeat it. Feminist movements of the 1960s and 1970s often looked back to the Victorian era as a symbol of oppression, contrasting their own demands for liberation with the restrictions of their foremothers. Art and literature carried the echoes as well. The Brontes, Eliot, and Gaskell remained central to the canon, their depictions of constrained heroines inspiring both admiration and critique. Later writers such as Virginia Woolf drew explicit connections between Victorian silence and modern struggles for voice. In her 1929 essay, A Room of One's Own, Woolf argued for the material and intellectual independence of women. an argument that resonated with centuries of women denied space, money, and recognition. Her call echoed through the walls of Victorian drawing rooms where countless voices had been stifled. The echoes also reveal continuities of struggle. Issues of labor, exploitation, sexual double standards, and unequal access to education persisted into the 20th century. Women continued to fight for recognition of domestic work, for legal equality in marriage, and for control over their bodies. Each battle was shaped by Victorian precedents, as reformers drew on both the successes and failures of earlier generations. Even the symbols of Victorian womanhood carried forward. The corset, though abandoned in the early 20th century, became a recurring metaphor in feminist discourse, representing the physical and social constraints imposed on women. The bicycle, once scandalous, became an emblem of liberation. The lace curtain, once a marker of propriety, became shorthand for secrecy and repression. These images echo not only in scholarship but in cultural memory, shaping how later societies understood the Victorian legacy. The global dimension of these echoes is equally important. British imperial expansion spread Victorian ideals of womanhood across the globe, influencing colonies from India to Africa. Yet it also spread the seeds of resistance. Women in colonized nations observed both the contradictions of British gender norms and the possibilities of reform. In the 20th century, movements for independence and women's rights in former colonies carried echoes of Victorian debates, adapted to local contexts. Perhaps the most enduring echo is the recognition that women's lives cannot be confined to silence. The diaries, letters, and stories that survived remind us that even in the most restrictive environments, women thought, felt, resisted, and dreamed. These fragments disrupt the myth of universal compliance, showing that history is always more complex than appearances. When we look back at Victorian women, we see both oppression and resilience. We see the gilded cage, but also the cracks in its bars. We hear the silence, but also the whispers that grew into voices. The echoes across time remind us that progress is never linear, never inevitable, but always built on the endurance and defiance of those who came before. Behind the lace curtains of the 19th century lay the foundations of the 20th and beyond.